I've always appreciated this quotation from Leslie Newbigin in his The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. He says, "The local congregation stands in the wider community of neighborhood and nation, not primarily as the promoter of programs for social change, but primarily as itself the foretaste of a different social order. Its members will be advocates for human liberation by themselves being liberated. Its actions for justice and peace will be and will be seen to be the overflow of a life in Christ where God's justice and peace are already an experienced treasure." So, hard to argue with, especially where he says, rather than see the church, it does not mean, by the way, the church doesn't ever have anything to do with justice and mercy and compassion for the poor. But he's right in saying the church is not primarily a promoter of programs for social change. It's primarily itself a foretaste of a different social order. It's showing the kind of social change that Jesus Christ makes right inside the congregation. And this isn't the only thing we're talking about today. This is the only feature of that changed new social order, but it's very, very important. So I promised that I would start to go all American on you and start to lay down practical steps or principles, right? Which I'm making fun of my own race there, but because we're so pragmatic and we're drawn to technique. We don't like principles and things like that. But here, let me descend to some degree. We don't have a whole lot of time today. Let me descend to technique. Let me talk to you a little bit about practical steps. And I'm going to give you 6. And I'm going to get through the first 5 pretty quickly, but don't get your hopes up. I'll spend more time on the 6th. Don't say, oh, this is going to be short. Don't get your hopes up. By the way, some of this is written, a man named George Yancey, African-American professor of sociology, I think, history perhaps, at University of North Texas. Right over the years, he studied the relationship between religion and race and religion and culture. And a book that's actually nobody ever seems to talk about it. It's a kind of old book now. It's called One Body, One Spirit: Principles of Successful Multiracial Churches. It came out in 2003. It's not that hard to find. And it's rather simple. I think one of the reasons why it's not more well known is it doesn't use language of radical and change the world and all that. It's just from an African American point of view, these are ways in which a church can become more diverse and multi-ethnic. So a lot of what I'm telling you here actually were inspired by his principles. I'm putting in a lot of my own experience. Okay, number 1, and I think I'm doing this in the right order. Number 1, you don't have a diverse congregation without diversifying your leadership first. We Americans are very, we think we invented democracy, but we do have a very democratic ethos, Over here, if they're going to put a building up, there might be some little sign, some little tiny sign that says you can come to a hearing about the change here for 5 minutes next month. In America, if they're going to put a new building up in a neighborhood, there's going to be weeks and weeks and weeks of absolutely open, vociferous, open meetings in which all the residents would come and yell. It's very American. Here, it's honestly, Europe is still more top-down, where the people in charge say that, this is the way it is, and America is more grassroots in general. And for that reason, Americans particularly say, well, you shouldn't racially diversify your leaders up here until the congregation is diversified. So if you have a third of your congregation is Spanish-speaking, well, then I guess you better go hire a Spanish-speaking pastor. That is absolutely wrong. The Americans are wrong. You can tweet that. Just say the Americans are wrong. Not about anything particular, just they're wrong. And you have to diversify up here before you're ever going to see diversity in your congregation. You have to intentionally racially diversify your leadership. You have to go to the mat. You have to do what it takes. I'll give you a couple of examples, but then some reasons why. Number one, when I started Redeemer, and one of the great, Kathy and I know that the reason why Kathy and I don't like to talk about how to raise your children for Christ is because it sounds like we know what we're talking about. Whenever you talk about it, it sounds like you did a good job, and we didn't. Our children have asked us not to lecture on how to raise your children for Christ. Because they say we're all Christians, but it was completely God's work, and it wasn't. And I shouldn't be talking about how to build a multi-ethnic church, because certainly the first 10 years, perhaps, of my being at Redeemer, it just was something I was more committed to in theory than in actual practice. Nevertheless, a lot of this is hindsight. So in the very beginning of Redeemer, when you walked in the doors for the very first 6 months, if you walked in the door for any church service, you saw only two faces up front. You saw mine, and you saw a Chinese woman who played the piano. So because there was the way the church was operating, we started in a Seventh-day Adventist church, and the piano was right there. And so my accompanist of all the songs was a Chinese woman, and I was, and obviously a white male. About 6 months later, I looked out there, and all I saw was a kind of half and half Asian and Anglo faces. I began to say, wait a minute, how did this happen? I wasn't trying to do that. And here's three reasons. When you walk in the door and you see a diverse group up there, why that's going to diversify your congregation. Number one, you feel welcomed. In other words, if you walk in and you see yourself up front, you just feel more welcomed. Simple as that. People walked in the door. They saw if they were Asian, they saw an Asian face up there. They just exhaled. In some small ways, I understand perfectly. It's not everybody's like that. That you feel welcome when you see. So in other words, a diverse up front created a diverse congregation, not the other way around. So one, there's a sense of you're welcoming a broader group of people. When the community, people walk in and they see a diverse leadership, they're actually feeling welcomed. Number two, they also realize you've given up power. Now, obviously, it's not absolutely necessarily true, but generally speaking, if you have people of different races on your staff, then let's say if you're a white, majority white congregation and you have a almost completely white staff and you begin to add non-white staff, the white people lose power because the non-white people can start to ask questions. And besides that, they're on the staff. They're paid. They've got power. And so when people walk in the door and they see a variety of a diverse staff or leadership up front, it doesn't have to just be staff. It can also be lay leaders and so on. They know the lay leaders have got power. They not only feel welcome, but they also know this congregation is actually willing to share power with people of other races. And then thirdly, there's just the wisdom. You walk in the door and you see diversity up there, and you know that people are going to be bringing people of other races are going to see things differently and know things that people of the other races don't know. And generally, the staff is going to be wiser. They're showing the gospel out in a way. They're exhibiting a willingness to share power on the part of everyone, and they're giving a sense of welcome to the community. So you've got to diversify your leadership before you're going to see a diverse congregation. You just got to do that. Some people, by the way, I'll just say, if you are a non-white person, you're going on the staff or the leadership of a church that's largely white, it's not an easy job. It can be very lonely. It can be very cold. It's like going out every day without a jacket. And yet, somebody's got to do it. It's got to get started that way. So very often, the bravest people I know and the most patient people I know are often a congregation that says, we want to diversify. By the way, this also works the other way around. Congregation that says, we want to diversify. And if you come in as a staff member or as a leader and you're really in a small minority racially in the church, it's not easy. But somebody's got to start it. Somebody's got to do it, or it's not going to happen. So A, diversified leadership. B, I don't know if I'm doing 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B. Oh, listen, A, B, stretched worship. Now, all I can tell you on this is that if you're having a multi-ethnic church, nobody's going to be utterly and radically and completely happy and comfortable with the worship. I don't know how else to say this. This is going to those 3 principles in Acts 15. It's that middle principle of saying, yes, of course, if you want to, you can certainly eat meat strangled. I mean, you can eat, animals strangled with their blood still in it, but don't. Because there's a lot of people out there who are going to find that really offensive and awful. And so it almost seems to me that multi-ethnic churches I know have to work enormously hard at creating worship services that don't completely satisfy, music especially, that don't completely satisfy everybody. Now, that's not easy, and I am not an expert on this. I do know of some churches that say you can't just have every single Sunday some kind of crazy blend. A lot of my musicians say they're all for the cultural diversity, but maybe not all of it in every service. And therefore, you might find that once a month or every other week or something like that, you actually change it up, which is, by the way, a lot of trouble and a lot of expense, basically. You usually have to have different musicians, and some people can get away with not paying them, but a lot of churches need to pay them. And so all I can say about stretch worship is, even though it's impossible to please everybody, in general, multi-ethnic churches work very, very hard at creating worship that is as inclusive as possible, but it's also always somewhat uncomfortable for everybody. Number B, that's B, stretch worship. C, goals beyond just being multiracial community. This is from George Yancey, I think. As important as it is to be a multiracial church and an ethnically diverse church, there are churches that becomes almost the reason they exist. And I'll tell you the reason why that can happen is because I'll get to D in a minute, because it actually can be quite a lot of work. The easiest thing is to be monoethnic because everybody agrees on everything. They agree on the worship, they agree on how you make decisions. Just to give you a quick example of this, I was told by my first Korean staff member years ago, he said, one day he said, it's really interesting how different our decision-making matrix is in this church compared to a Korean church. And I said, how so? He said, well, what's interesting is when Redeemer has a staff meeting and you're trying to make a decision, you don't let anybody know what you think. Instead, you say, well, I want to know what other people think. And then other people talk and they argue, and in the end, you might break the tie, or you might say, well, in the end, I think we ought to go this way, or you might try to bring consensus. He says, boy, that is not the way it works in a Korean church. I said, why? I said, in a Korean church, if we have a decision to make, the senior pastor speaks first and says, this is what I want. And then everybody speaks in order of age and seniority. So what happened is the next senior person will say, and here's what I think, and then the next senior person, each one gets a chance, in a sense, to tweak what the senior pastor's already said. So by the time you get to the end and you're one of the junior, all you get to say is, you said it, absolutely great idea, coach. Put me in, coach, put me in, I want to play. So there's not much to say. And he says, well, it makes me nervous because he says, I want to know what the big dog thinks before I open my mouth. He said, I'd like to know where you stand. I know you've got some idea, and I don't want to open my mouth. So we talked a little bit about this to say, okay, I said, but now what would be he understood that he had a stretch. And he understood that as a member of a multi-ethnic, or an increasingly multi-ethnic, at the time it wasn't very multi-ethnic, staff, that he had to, in a way, fit in. He had a stretch. But he was also saying, Isn't it a little bit false on your part? Aren't you acting a little more humble? I mean, don't you have a view? Actually, a lot of the other guys would like to know what your view is too. And so he forced me into thinking about how to make decisions. And I began to realize there's no culturally neutral way even to sit down and have a staff meeting. You know that. And that's the reason why it can be so extremely, in a multi-ethnic setting, it can take so much time always talking about our diversity. Always talking about how do we be a multi-ethnic, a diverse church in this situation, in the way we do this, and the way we do this. And George Yancey's rightly saying, this is C, you've got to remember your main goals, in the end, being multi-ethnic, being an Ephesians 2 church is just a means to other ends. We're trying to lift up the gospel. We're trying to win people to Christ. We're trying to have God-anointed worship. We're actually trying to do all the things. We're trying to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Presbyterians, did you like that? That's what we want to do. And he says, you've got to be careful that you don't you come to almost have the being a multiracial, diverse church becomes the end instead of a means to an end. So you have to have goals beyond just being multiracial. D, and I've already given you a hint, is patient intentionality. Patient intentionality. Having just said you've got to have other goals, the reality is the more culturally diverse your church is, the more you will find that things that other churches do just like this take a lot of deliberation. And so everything seems to take more and more time, and that's the reason why it takes patience. Having a worship service, in the old days it was traditional or Christian contemporary, which, that wasn't, by the way, that was a fight anyway, but with a lot of people. But now there's so many, in a multi-racial church, worship, how you make decisions, how you communicate, how you set up community, how you counsel, everything. Sometimes you feel like I have to reinvent the wheel on absolutely everything. And guess what? You just say that's the price you pay for something that is of unbelievably high value, which is an Ephesians 2 church. So everybody's got to have it settled. It's going to take time. There's also going to be a lot of misunderstandings. There's going to be hurt feelings. There is no doubt about it that that after you've had a number of conflicts where the people of the other race just don't seem to get it at all, it is you just at a certain point you want to just go back to a monoethnic church where people aren't always arguing. But you have to say this is a price you pay, and that is to have the misunderstandings, to take a lot longer on everything, that you gladly pay it, not gritted teeth. You gladly pay it because you say this is one of the ways in which the gospel is working itself into our people's lives, getting down to the bottom of their identity. And it's also a way that the community is actually seeing the gospel's power. So it's absolutely worth it. But what you have to do is it means a lot of long conversations that that in a monoethnic church you wouldn't even be having to have, and a lot of hurt feelings and people getting upset. And at a certain point you want to say, I don't really want to deal with this, but you do have to deal with it. So patient intentionality. So A, B, C, D. E is location. Sorry to get really, really practical, but the fact is that there are churches that have said we want to be multi-ethnic, we want to be diverse, and they don't locate well. They locate in a place where one particular group it's very easy to get to and others not. I actually do remember Dick Kaufman, who was my executive pastor at Redeemer years ago, many years ago, late 90s, early 90s maybe, and we met in Hunter College on the Upper East Side. And at one point we got our, we had a very small number of African Americans, but we got our African American members together back in the 90s, and we sat there and said, help us, because we're Asian and we're Anglo, but we have very few African Americans. What could we do? I don't remember everything we were told. One of them was stretch the worship. But I do remember the other thing was don't meet on the east side. They said, where you meet is terrible. Meet on the west side. And we said, well, that's not the easiest thing. What do you mean? And they said, well, west side has all these, east side has one, well, they've changed it now, has one tube subway line, and we just don't go here. We're just not here, by and large. Meet on the west side. That's where the lines are. That's where it goes back and forth. And it was, by the way, interesting, when we first started meeting on the west side, almost immediately, they were right, that there was almost immediately a change somewhat in the ethnic makeup on the west side. So location, don't forget location. And now lastly, I told you, don't get your hopes up, but I won't take too long on this. And that is intentional cross-cultural friendships. We were talking about this earlier. Intentional cross-cultural friendships. Now, if I was in China, I was recently in Korea, and I noticed that virtually every single, in the subway or the tube, every single sign was in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and English. And evidently, there's lots of speakers of those four groups all through Seoul. And perhaps if I was in Seoul, I'd be talking about how do you get those four groups to be in a church. But here, I'm going to just say this: in both the UK and the US, generally speaking, you've got the dominant. Doesn't mean that we're even the majority anymore, but white Anglo-Americans, white Anglo British people may not even be eventually we will not be the majority in real numbers, but we are still the dominant majority. We're a dominant plurality. We still have the power. It's still we still basically hold the cards. And so when you're trying to have a multi-ethnic church, it usually means that there's the white people and there's everybody else. When it comes, because I'm going to say, here's what the white people need to know if you're going to have cross-cultural friendships, and here's what the non-white people need to know. Okay? So here's what the white people need to know. One is the non-white people know way, way, way more about your culture than you know about theirs. Infinitely more. Because you see, they've come here and they can be in their culture, but then they have to come out kind of into the white dominant culture just to have jobs. In other words, they know about us. We don't know anything about them. So when you get into a cross-cultural friendship with a brother or sister from another race, you need to realize that you have way more to learn from them than they do from you, just to let you know. Do you start that way? I mean, my first real friend, Kathy and I had a good friend in college and at Gordon Conwell named Elward Ellis, African-American from Newark. Became a Presbyterian minister, has already passed away. But Elward used to say to me a couple things. He says, first of all, you have to realize that when you look at other people who are white, you don't think of them the way I look at other people who are black. That is, when I look in the mirror, I see a black man. When you look in the mirror, you don't see a white man. You just see what you think is a normal man. Okay? He says, when you see me in church preaching the way I do, or singing the way I do, you say, oh, that's interesting. That's your black approach to church. But when you do church, you don't say it's the white approach to church. You just say it's the right approach to church. He says, in other words, you don't see the whiteness of your culture. In other words, you don't see your culture. You see our culture, but you don't see your culture. You just see this is just the way things are done. It's not the white way to do things. It's just the way things are done. And what that means, though, is when you come into a church, there's a tendency to say, okay, well, what are we going to do to accommodate these people who are different? Actually, you need to rethink everything and realize you've got a culture, they've got a culture. And the Bible is our basis, but no one culture is the basis for the church. And so that's the reason why you need, number one, white people, in these cross-cultural friendships, you need to realize you know a lot less about their culture. You know a lot less about their culture than they know about yours. You have a lot more to learn, which is extremely important to know. Number two, white people, don't be too quick to, especially if you're a white person who's trying for a multi-ethnic church, don't be too quick to deny racism in yourself, okay? I don't mean you have to be always beating your breast and say what a racist I am. But do a little bit of heart look. For example, do you have trouble finding spokespersons of other races credible? Can you be honest about that? That you just don't find them as credible? Or do you take Do you make little snap judgments about a person on the basis of their race that you would never do for a white person? Just don't deny that there's really racism there. One of the problems, of course, for us white people is that the culture talks to us a great deal about our racism, and then a defensiveness builds up, a natural defensiveness everybody's got, to say, oh, I'm not that bad. Well, certainly for these cross-cultural friendships, you do need to be, if you're a white person, you need to ask, yeah, maybe it's there, and so look for it and be honest about it. And lastly, do everything you can to weep with those who weep. In other words, try to put yourself in the shoes of a person who's living as a minority in a majority culture. Weep for those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice means Christians are supposed to be seeking to understand the inner worlds of other Christians. That's what that means in Romans 12:15. Christians ought to be very quick. Weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice. Means we're trying to find out how people feel and understand their inner worlds, and that's what we're trying to do in cross-cultural friendships. Now, those of you who are non-white, you get into a cross-cultural friendship. Now, of course, your cross-cultural friendship might be not with a white person, of course. It might be an African with an Asian or something like that. But let me just suggest a couple things still for non-white people in cross-cultural friendships, Christians now. Number one, beware of the Phariseeism of being a victim. I mean, I have to be very careful about this because I'm a white guy talking to you, but all I know is this. Whenever somebody has wronged me, whenever anybody has wronged me, the biggest danger is to feel noble about it. See, the human heart is so self-justifying, it hates the gospel. So the human heart is so self-justifying that the minute, it never misses an opportunity for salvation by works. Never. And so someone hurts you and wrongs you, right away your heart starts to say, I would never do anything like that to anybody. I would never do anything like that to anybody. And you start to feel very noble and better than the other people. Now, this would also be true as if you were a victim of racial prejudice. Because you're a victim, you've been wronged, and it's extraordinarily easy to start to feel noble. And basically, it's a form of Phariseeism, of self-righteousness. It's not a gospel attitude. So be very, very careful about that. Number two, overcome evil with good. You must be truthful. That's number three. Don't be afraid. You got to keep talking truth to, especially your white brothers and sisters. You can't say, I've had it, nobody's listening to me. You've got to continue to speak truth. But you do it in a way not to punish, but to overcome evil with good. That's also Romans 12:9-21. Let me just, we want to have I remember, let me give you a quick example of how this could work. When I was at Westminster Seminary teaching many, many years ago, Westminster Seminary has a lot of Korean students from Korea, not Korean American, Korean. And there was I was as a faculty member, I was leading a group of Christians it was a multiracial group of students. And we were all talking about things that they were facing in their ministry situations. And one young man had a fascinating example. He was Korean, and he was trying to get the job. He was applying for a job at a Korean church of a kind of untranslatable. He said it was called chondosa, which means junior, kind of like youth minister, junior preacher, something like that. So he was applying for the job, and he was talking with the elders of the church, the Korean elders, and things were going along quite well until he looked like they were going to hire him, until he said, well, what's the salary? And they said, well, that's the end of this interview. Because what they said was, if you are committed, you have become too Americanized. You're so individualistic that you want to know the salary before you take the job? Where we're from, you're loyal to us, you're not to yourself, and you do your duty, and we'll tell you how much you should be paid. And the Korean came back and he said, yeah, even though he wasn't, he's from Korea and he'd been living in the country for a couple of years, he says, yeah, maybe I have gotten Americanized, because he says, that sounds to me like a recipe for exploitation. And I remember we spoke about the fact that the Americans, of course, were absolutely appalled. And but the Koreans were trying to say, yeah, but you Americans are just so, it's like, it's all about you. It's all about you. It's never about the church. It's never about the family. It's all about you. If this isn't benefiting you, if it's not helping you in your career path, you're just out of the door. And so we had a wonderful talk discussion in which it was very clear we were knocking the rough edges off of each other. We were challenging each other's, you might say, cultural extremes that I do think were idols. We talked about this before, the idol of the individual, the idol of the family and the clan and all that. And they were getting to a place which I think was just it was shaped by the gospel. It was shaped through gospel-based cross-cultural Christian friendships. They were all coming to a place they were not before, and they never would have come to without that cross-cultural friendship. I think I can end right there, but yeah, I think we're going to end right there and take some questions. So, Peter, please.
Tim, thanks. I think I speak for most of us when I say appreciate the first session being more conceptual, big picture, and then drilling down into the detail, though no doubt that provokes lots of questions. So let's see how we go now. Same deal as before, 2 mics. So hands from the floor. One at the back, just behind you, Woody, there.
Yeah, I'm Remy from City Church, Manchester. The final point that you mentioned there, I thought was very, very, very true. I completely relate to what you said there. But how do you actually create a space where people can be honest and share these different, I suppose, what at one point was an unconscious racial bias, I suppose, but then was brought to light? Is there a space where you can actually do that, where different groups of people can come together? As was mentioned previously, a lot of the time people do go into their own subcultures in churches, so they don't really have that kind of open space where they can talk.
Yeah. Well, one thing I know, I know Pamela's here, would be able to speak to this a little bit. At Redeemer, we created something. Now, it's been going on for so many years. I'm sure there were better years and worse years. We actually created basically a body inside Redeemer where we challenge people to come for cross-racial friendships. You come in, you're forming cross-racial friendships, and we're going to talk about these things, and we're going to come closer. We called it Race and Grace, just to give it a cool American sort of brand name anyway. Called it Race and Grace, and basically it was a way of not forcing these conversations on everybody, because the fact is, in any congregation, there's a lot of people that just aren't ready for it. In fact, a lot of people aren't, we're not sure they're Christians yet, and they're coming. So you got to be careful about forcing something that takes a fair amount of gospel maturity, those kinds of conversations on everybody in the congregation. And so what we did was we actually created a space where, and I've always heard great things over the years about it. I'm sure there were better and worse years, where people came together just to have these conversations. So you're letting people know about it so they can kind of volunteer in. And I think, eventually, that is a little bit like it salts the whole church eventually. It just has an impact on the whole church. Sometimes the Race and Grace group could do a special conference for the whole church and bring in some speakers and let them do it in front of everyone. Where you could, if you get some pretty mature people, you could bring up a topic and let the speakers from the very diverse group of speakers actually have the conversation in front of the congregation. So there's a couple ideas.
Thank you. One here at the front. Oh, is there one there? Come to the front, and we'll do that one next.
Tommy from Christchurch, Liverpool. I'm curious, cycles where the two groups are just kind of perpetuating this, where the problem's acknowledged, but they're both perpetuating. So in our context, we have a large international population that comes to a group. We're about 40% Anglo, 40% not Anglo in our student ministry. What ends up happening is the international students come late to everything because they assume the Anglos don't want to do that and to interact with them, and the Anglos don't interact with them because they're coming late to everything.
And what are you asking me for?
What,
But, I was trying to get practical, but I mean, this is really practical.
well, when it's a cycle where it just kind of perpetuates based on assumptions, even if they're acknowledged,
So you're asking me,
what's an experience that you might have had?
I do, yes, but I do remember once having a wedding between a Hispanic and an Anglo person, and of course, at 2 p.m., all the white people were in their seats, and the Hispanics were not there. In fact, the bride wasn't anywhere to be seen, and she was the Hispanic. And when they all got there around 2:45, the service went on and proceeded, and then afterwards there was a reception. At the reception, there was lots and lots of discussions about culture. Because actually the white people all said to the Hispanics, about the Hispanics, frankly, that was so inconsiderate. We have places to go and people to see and things to do. And of course, the Hispanics thought, what a bunch of uptight people. An event happens when we're all here. In fact, there are anthropologists that talk about event-oriented cultures and time-oriented cultures. And a time-oriented culture is like your German, for example. If it says it's going to happen at 2 o'clock, it happens at 2 o'clock. That's a time-oriented culture. And in an event-oriented culture, people get there when they get there. There's actually a great book in which it talks about when are you late? And you can, so in German culture, like 5 minutes. In American culture, it's like 15 minutes. It's on the Isle of Yap. As long as you get there that day. If you get there tomorrow, you're late. Now, where does it say in the Bible that punctuality is next to godliness? It doesn't. You have to work together on this. You just have to talk. But it's not and you get what's really amazing is, again, the human heart never overlooks an opportunity for self-righteousness and self-justification. Because the more punctual people, which is, I'm being a little unfair even using the term, the more punctual people say, they moralize it. They say, we're disciplined and we're considerate, and those people are not. And you turn everything, of course, actually, the Hispanics moralize it too. A bunch of uptight, fuddy-duddies, we know you kind of people, and you don't know how to relax, and you're not relational like we are, and you moralize it, and it's very pharisaical. What you need to do is you do need to flex for each other. That's stretching. But you need to talk about it. And then you need to keep people use the gospel to keep them from becoming self-righteous about their cultural difference.
Thank you. There's one at the back here. I don't know whether we were missing one there.
Andrew Bourne from School of Faith. Tim.
Where are you, Andrew? Oh, there you are.
On there. I don't know if you've been watching Love Island while you've been... but it's the topic of conversation in all workplaces every day at the moment. And it's a competition, a reality show, basically. But the division amongst the contestants isn't really about colour of skin, it's more about class. And I wonder, is that a form of racism, or is that particularly...
He said it's not about...
colour of skin, it's about class. That's the layer of the onion, really, that divides people.
Okay.
It's class, worldview, and everything is set by class in the UK.
Well, look, listen, I'm glad you brought... Andrew, that's a really important topic. I'm not about to give you any definitive answer. But yes, in who tried to start a church in a university town. He had 20 people, and he says it's the most multi-ethnic church in town, but they were all PhD students. And there is something about having a PhD that definitely change. You're not just learning your intellectual field, you're being socialized. You are being changed culturally by a PhD experience. And it was, and for him to be crowing about how multi-ethnic his church was when it was not just monoclassal, but it was very, very, it was a very elite group, an extremely elite group. I don't think that's Ephesians 2. But I also think it is harder in general to, certainly you've all found this out, it's harder in general to combine races, combine classes and the races. So it's much harder to have a church that's got some working poor, some middle class, and some professional people in it, to just simply having people of the same race if they're all PhD students or all professionals. And I do think you have to keep that in mind. And also, as you know, more education tends to flatten a lot of the cultural differences, and that's the reason why there are people who are very happy with how multicultural we are, but everybody's a highly paid professional or a PhD. So I'm just saying, class is important too. We are trying to unite classes as well. I have to tell you, though, as a preacher, that there's, you talk about stretching to be inclusive. It's one thing to stretch, for me, to have a bunch of people, they're all out there, they all have MBAs, this is Redeemer in New York City, and they're different races. Even there, I have to understand the differences. But if I have to start talking to people who are much more working class, as well as highly paid professional, that's a real challenge too, just to give a sermon that's understandable to everybody, and to provide illustrations that are understandable to everybody. So, nevertheless, all the things I've said are all the principles for being multi-class as well as multi-race abide. I mean, they all apply, but it really is an additional level of complexity.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. One final one from this people. There we are.
Hi, my name's Johnny from The Gate, a small church plant in a central estate in Birmingham.
Okay.
And you spoke about the need to appoint a multi-ethnic leadership team.
Right.
As a church, we would long to do that. It's a multi-ethnic, socioeconomically diverse area that we're in. And yet we don't reflect that area just yet. We long to do that, but we don't have those people to appoint. So how we're one step behind that. How would we get to a stage where we could even think about doing that?
Wow, great. I haven't. You're right. It's silly. This is a city-to-city UK event, and I haven't really talked about church planting much here. I'm assuming that people have churches and they're trying to make them more multi-ethnic. So if you're starting off, well, I have a commitment. This is personal, but again, there's other city-to-city people here. I do think that there's a lot of pressure on church planters in the beginning to show results. And there's two things that happen when so we want to gather the Christians as fast as we possibly can. We want to get people in the seats. We want to get giving, because we want to be able to say, oh, look, we're up to 20, we're up to 50, we're up to this. We want to say that. Generally speaking, if you do that too fast, you gather Christians, and usually of one particular ethnic group. If you're willing to slow it down, there's two things you can do better. One is evangelism. The fact is that a church plant that starts with lots and lots of new Christians through evangelism always gets out of the gate slower. And a church where you work very hard at intentional cross-cultural relationships so that the church is more diverse also slows everything down. So what you've got to do is you have to say, who is it that's watching me plant this church? Is it a mother church? Is it a denominational agency? Is it somebody else? Because I've got to buy time. I've got to get them to see the vision. We want this to be evangelistic. We want it to be multi-ethnic, so it's really reaching the community. And therefore, I need to find out what my expectations are. How fast? How fast do I have to grow? How big do you want me to be? How quickly do I have to develop a self-sustaining support base, financial support base? Because the faster you push me to do that, the more mono-ethnic and the less evangelistic my church will be. So all I did was give you a spectrum. You need it takes time. And of course, you're under pressure. But honestly, evangelism takes time, and developing multi-ethnic congregation takes time too. It's not a recipe for a fast start. That's all I can say.